Congratulations, folks. It's last lecture for 106. We have made it. You have made it, right? I was kind of confident I would make it. I was hoping I'd make it. So today we'll be covering reproductive systems. We'll start with the male, and we'll do as much of the female as possible. And that's pretty much where I always get in this class. I get to this place, and I get through the male, and I get through part of the female. Whatever I do not finish, I'll make a decision at the end. I've already written the exam, so I know where I have to get. And so I'll let you know what might be extra credit points or what we'll stop at as we go through this. This exam is going to cover what? Urinary. We had 2 full lectures on that, as well as some acid-base regulation. That was part of that chapter 24. And then the reproductive systems, plural, 27 and 28. There are 2 quizzes online for those who have already done all 14 quizzes. If I noticed it this morning, as of this morning, I've been sort of going through and knocking off your 4 lowest grades, and it will say grade exempt. And I haven't done everybody's, but as I see them finishing all 14 quizzes, I've been getting that done. I'll certainly have that completely done during your exam on Thursday, so everyone will have that turned in by then. Are there any questions right now logistically? Lab exam tonight in blue and gold. Final on Thursday, 4 o'clock, also in blue and gold. Full-length exam, you'll need a Scantron for that on Thursday. Tonight, you just need a pencil. When will I have the lab exams graded? The ones I did this afternoon, I probably will grade during this evening's exam. So my goal is to have this afternoon's exams graded and posted before I leave tonight. The evening, I don't know if I'll get them done this evening or not. Okay? So, as I have on here, you're going to be looking at 20 through 47 on your own, and that's going to be just basically 105 structures. And we'll start off this conversation just thinking about overall the fact that we are a two-sex being, if you will, and that we're biparental, meaning that we receive genes from 2 parents. This is pretty obvious, and none of us are exactly alike because we have received genes that were scrambled during the formation of the gametes or the sex cells. And the zygote is that union. Remember, zyg means the union or pairing of. And so when the egg and sperm come together to form that fertilized egg, that is the zygote, the beginning of the life cycle for the embryo. Again, 2 gametes combine to form the zygote. The sperm obviously has motility, and the egg contains the nutrients. So they each bring to the zygote something unique. The egg is bringing some yolk and some nutrients. Remember that embryo has to travel for 5 or 6 days down the fallopian tube, and then it has to establish a connection with the placenta and with the uterus, and so we have to have nutrients for that time. Remember, too, that sex is determined by the male. That is, the male can provide an X or a Y chromosome. The female only can provide X chromosomes, and so sex is determined at the time of fertilization. Male reproductive, female reproductive systems, again, we'll go through the organs. This is all very straightforward. The primary sex organ, if I ask what is the primary sex organ, that's going to be the gonads. That's going to be either the testes or the ovaries. If I ask instead for the copulatory organ, that'd be the penis or the vagina. So we'll just make that distinction that the primary sex organ is the gonad, the hormone-producing, the gamete-producing organ, and everything else is really going to be considered accessory, and we'll get into some of those structures as we review. So the primary sex organs, there they are again. They are the gonads. They are the gamete-producing, that is the testes or ovaries. Everything else would be considered secondary or accessory sex organs, and that's going to be all the duct work, all the plumbing, all of the other structures would be considered secondary. External versus internal, of course, the male is mostly external, located in the perineum, whereas the female is largely internal. Again, we know this, no problem there. Secondary sex characteristics are initiated by hormone production, and those hormones begin at the onset of puberty with the male producing androgens, testosterone being the primary hormone, females estrogen and progesterone, and that's going to lead to pubic hair, axillary hair, the lovely scent glands. How teenagers start to stink a lot more when they exercise, when they hit puberty, and it's also going to affect the thickness of the vocal cords, giving us a difference in the pitch of our voice. Also the coarser hair on our bodies and breast development in the female. Now, there are situations where things don't go as expected, and I'll just mention this, not try to get too sidetracked on this, but we are all female by default. So up through about the 5th or 6th week of embryological development, there is no differentiation between testes and ovaries. And everything looks exactly the same. And if the Y chromosome is there, and that is testosterone is being produced, and there are receptors for that testosterone, then structures begin to be inhibited. The female structures are inhibited, and the male structures are then allowed to develop. There are situations where there are receptor problems. You know that a hormone is only effective while traveling through the body if there is a receptor that can receive that hormone. And if the receptor doesn't exist, then it might as well not have any hormone either, right? So if you don't have the receptor, the hormone cannot be received. So some individuals have an androgen insensitivity syndrome. That is, they don't have the testosterone receptors. In other words, they're making testosterone, but their body can't see it. So these individuals are by default, I mean, they're male by genetics, right? They're male, they have an X and a Y, they have testes, they're making testosterone, but the testosterone is not being received or noticed by the cell because or the body because there is a insufficiency or an insensitivity or a lacking of the receptor for the testosterone. So what ends up is that you now have a person with a male karyotype, that is their X and Y, they have X and Y chromosomes. We would expect them to be fully male. But upon physical development, we notice that they are female, at least externally. And again, it's because we're female by default, and the male androgens, the testosterones, aren't being seen to cause the male plumbing to form, then the genitalia are going to be female in appearance. Now, there's still testes. There's no functional uterus. There's no functional ovaries. And so these women are sterile. There is no uterus, there is no menstruation, and this usually would not be diagnosed or noticed until the teenage years, and even then, oftentimes it's sort of blown over because these women, being, quote, male, are going to have a thinner pelvis, right, a narrower pelvis. They're going to be very muscular, very tall women. They're likely going to be very athletic. And many athletic women don't begin menses or have abnormal menses anyway because they don't have enough fat on their body. So a woman who's very muscular, who's very athletic, who doesn't have enough fat production to start menses, maybe wouldn't even be alarmed by a lack of menstruation until after marriage even, trying to start a family. So kind of an interesting side note, and it certainly gives us at least a pause when you're discussing sex versus gender. At least this is one biological explanation for variations on the theme. These women are female, right, by all external signals, right? They're female, but they have some inadequate or incomplete male plumbing. So as I mentioned, we have the chromosomes, 23 pairs in you and me. We are said to be diploid. We have 2 sets of all the chromosomes. 22 pairs of those are considered the autosomes or the body chromosomes, and then the other pair are the sex chromosomes. There are some variations on this that you'll discuss if you take a genetics course, but for that we'll go with the normal. That is XX female and XY being the male. Again, sex of the child is determined at the time of fertilization by which chromosome the male provides in the sperm. Y, this child, the zygote, will be male. If it's an X, the offspring would be female. As I mentioned too, there's an undifferentiation through about the 5th or 6th week of development. So up until that point, there is no difference. And there are 2 sets of ducts, if you will, the Wolffian ducts and the Mullerian ducts. Now, these are named after Wolff and Mueller, but to me, they look like the word wolf and mule. Okay, so the Wolffian ducts are going to develop into the male reproductive system. The Mullerian ducts are going to develop into the female reproductive plumbing. And so I just remember men are wolves and women are mules. And it works, right? So men are wolves and women are mules, and we'll remember that, no problem. Now, one of the genes found on the Y chromosome that is very important is the SRY. It's referred to as a sex-determining region, so sex-determining S, region RY. And it's just a section of the Y chromosome, or a gene on the Y chromosome, which is very important in development of the testes. So again, if this gene is present, then the testes would form. If this gene were not present, then the testes would not form. So this would be another example where a person could have a mutated Y chromosome, and they would look to be male by karyotype. They have an X and a Y, but if the Y is deficient or doesn't have the SRY, then they would not form the testes. This SRY gene and this testes determining factor is also going to stimulate those Wolffian ducts and interfere with or inhibit the Müllerian ducts. And the testes also secrete a molecule called Müllerian inhibiting factor. So again, what is it doing? It's knocking out the mules, right? It's knocking out all the female duct system and allowing the Wolffian systems to develop. So testosterone then is really the sex determining hormone. It's not estrogen. And the reason we know it's not estrogen is that during pregnancy, even a male fetus is exposed to high estrogens. Estrogen is a normal hormone found in high levels during pregnancy. So if it was just the exposure of estrogen, then that wouldn't be enough, right? So we know that estrogen does not direct female development. Really, it's the lack of testosterone that leads females to be females, and it's the presence of testosterone that causes males to be males. Another way of saying that, females still develop in the absence, right? Females develop in the absence of androgens or in the absence of testosterone. So not to get too hooked into this, just know that there are two sets of ductwork here. I'm not going to ask you to label these or anything, but in the very beginning, during early development, they are sitting side by side. There's no differentiation. And then over here, the testes are forming on the blue side, the male side, and that's the Wolffian ducts. And then over on the other side, on the pink side, the Müllerian ducts are allowed to develop. Not to get too excited about that, this is the bladder in these pictures, right? So the bladder, okay, and that's going to develop in all of them, of course. So early on in development, again, there is some homologous structures. We discussed this in 105. So because the male and female genitalia do develop from the same structures, these are called homologous. So that means that the glands of the penis or the head of the penis is the same as the tip of or the glands of the clitoris. The labia major would be the same as the scrotum. Right, so the larger fold of skin, the labia major, would be the equivalent to the scrotum. And also there are little urogenital folds that enclose the urethra in the male, forming the penis as well as the labia minor. By 12 weeks, male and female are differentiated. So in a sonogram, usually we have that sonogram done at 20 weeks. By then things are very clearly developed. But you would be able to see the difference by 12 weeks if the baby were to cooperate in a sonogram. It's also very important that the testes descend. Okay, so in the male, if the testes were to stay up in the abdominal pelvic cavity and not descend down through the inguinal ligament and into the scrotum, then there'd be issues. About the 7th month of development, so a couple months before birth, typically the testes will drop down or pass through the inguinal ligament into the scrotum, and they're guided by this really cool thing called the gubernaculum. That's just one of those words you need to know. So I love this word, the gubernaculum. Now, the gubernaculum is, if you look it up in Wiki or in dictionary.com, it's something that guides, right? So the gubernaculum is guiding, here we go. The gubernaculum is going to guide the testes down into the scrotum. Along with the testes, of course, we're going to have the testicular arteries, the veins, lymphatic vessels, nerves, the vas deferens. All of those things will also move down as part of the spermatic cord. Some boys are born without their testes descended, cryptorchidism. So remember, orchid is testis as vocab term. So the cryptorchidism is undescended. It happens about 3% of boys, and in most cases, hormones will bring it down. It will happen. But if it doesn't happen naturally, shortly after birth, typically the baby will be given some testosterone injections, right? And that will actually, those hormones will actually help usually coax or push those testes down. If that doesn't happen, then surgery is necessary. Because if the testes do not descend, then the person is sterile because the sperm can't produce, and we know that undescended testes are at a higher risk for testicular cancer. So it is important to get those testes down into the scrotum so that normal sperm production can occur as well. Now, the ovaries do descend a little bit within the female abdominal pelvic cavity, but of course nowhere near as low. They do have a little gubernaculum that also pulls them down and supports them against the uterus. So this is just showing you that in the 3-month fetus, the testes are high and up in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then by the 8th month, they typically are descending down, and certainly are usually fully descended by the 1st month after life. And this green structure, right, this green structure, that is the gubernaculum. So it's literally like this ligament that's pulling down. It's attached to the testes. It's attached to the base of the scrotum and literally pulls down the testes into their proper location. The next slides are just anatomy. So just review that on your own. Read through it. You know the structures. So we'll just go right through this quickly. And what slide am I stopping on? What did I say at the very first slide? 47, okay. I'll stop at a couple of things that may be new for you. So here on 26, there are 2 muscles that are going to help regulate the temperature for sperm production. And these are the cremaster and the dartus muscles. The cremaster muscle is enmeshing the spermatic cord. And when this contracts, it's going to draw the testes upward toward the body to keep the sperm production about 2 degrees cooler than body temperature. And in warmer temperatures, it's going to relax, and the testes will be further away. The dartus muscle is actually within the scrotum itself. And when it's cold, the dartus muscle will cause the wrinkling of the scrotum and hold the testes closer. And when it is warmer, it'll lessen that wrinkling, if you will, and increase the surface area to increase the heat loss. So we've got those couple muscles keeping the testes at the right distance from the body. There's also the papilliform plexus. Anybody remember what that is? The papilliform plexus is a name for this series of veins that are traveling through the spermatic cord. And this is another mechanism for keeping the temperature optimized. The warm blood coming to the scrotum, coming in the testicular artery, would be at body temperature. And that temperature of blood would be too warm, right? It would interfere with or could inhibit sperm production. And so as that testicular artery is coming down through the spermatic cord, it is passing next to a series of veins which are cooler in their temperature. And what it's actually doing is cooling the blood coming down into the scrotum so that, again, we're not bombarding the sperm with warmer temperatures. So by the time the blood gets down to the testes, it's 1.5 to 2.5 degrees cooler Celsius than it would have been for body temperature. So again, another way, we've got the dartus, the cremaster muscle, and the papilliform plexus, and the fact that the testes are in the scrotum, all are contributing to keeping the temperature for sperm production lower. So in this picture, you can see the papilliform plexus, again, this series of veins that are traveling next to the testicular arteries, traveling down into the scrotum. The testes, remember, are both exocrine and endocrine. They are endocrine in that they are producing sex hormones. They are exocrine in that they are producing sperm. And down in the testes, there are Leydig cells. The Leydig cells are in between the seminiferous tubules, recall, and these are the testosterone-producing cells. There are also Sertoli cells, and these are they are sometimes called the nurse cells. They're actually helping to provide nutrients and get rid of waste products for the germ cells. So when I say germ cells here, what am I talking about? When I say germ cell in general, what does germ cell mean to you? Cell that continues to regenerate to make more tissues, right? And so in the testes, what are the germ cells? I don't think that word's come up yet. It's spermatogonia. Right, and those cells are found where? They're found around the cortex, around the outside of the seminiferous tubules. And so these nurse cells are there to protect those cells, right? They have to, just like the egg has to be protected throughout the lifespan of the female, the spermatogonia, if they're destroyed, right, you would not be able to produce more sperm. And so it's important that those cells are nourished, if you will, and protected, and these Sertoli cells are going to do that. Structurally, just really quick, we've got the spermatic cord, and that is everything that's traveling down through, and that would include the papilliform plexus, the lymphatic tissues, the nerves, the vas deferens, the epididymis, right, the comma-shaped organ, the testis itself, and it is covered by a layer called the tunica albuginea, and then the scrotum here has been pulled back away from the testes. It's interesting that sperm would be considered foreign to the male's immune system, right? Because what do sperm represent? Cells that have been rearranged genetically. And so each sperm would be attacked by the male's immune system. In fact, there are some situations, some diseases where the male's immune system does target the sperm and destroys them, and that's a fertility issue. But typically, there's what's called the blood-testis barrier. You've heard about the blood-brain barrier, right? And that was maintained by those astrocytes back in the brain. But there are these nurse cells, these Sertoli cells, actually help to create tight junctions, and this is going to keep the sperm away from the male's immune system. So when a sperm are produced, they don't come in contact with the blood at all. Remember, your blood is what carries your immune cells, it's what carries your macrophages and your neutrophils and the other cells of your immune system. And so we want to make sure that the sperm production is separated from blood production, and it's done so by this blood-testis barrier. If I looked into the testis and I looked into a seminiferous tubule, so this is the actual tubule here, and there's another one over here, and there's another one down here, then the spermatogonia would be cells around the outside edge. And remember that within the lumen, what are we going to see released in the lumen? Right? You're going to see the flagella emerging into the lumen of the tubule. In between the tubules, here's another tubule over here. In between the tubules are these islands of cells. Those are the interstitial cells, or the other name for those are the Leydig cells. So the testosterone-producing cells are found out between the tubules. I'll just let you read through this. I've already mentioned most of this, just for structures. Remember, there are three accessory glands. I just mentioned them quickly. There are the seminal vesicles. They are a pair of them. They're found on the posterior side of the bladder. They're going to produce about 60% of the seminal fluid. Do you remember what they make? The seminal vesicles are making what sorts of things? Remember from 105? The seminal vesicles are producing fructose, right? Sugar for the sperm. They're producing a very alkaline fluid to protect the sperm from the acidity of the vagina. They're also producing prostaglandins, right? Smooth muscle relaxers to help open up the cervix. The prostate gland, just one of them, has a bunch of glands within it. It's also producing about 30% of the semen. And then there are the Cowper glands or the bulbourethral glands, and they are the pre-ejaculatory glands. They're going to produce mucousy solution, which is going to help cleanse the urethra before ejaculation and get rid of that acidic urine, as well as prepare for intercourse. The prostate is prone to enlargement. This is called BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia. Benign, right? It's not cancerous. It's just it's a growth. And this is not uncommon in men over 50, and it starts to push on the urethra. It also starts to push up on the internal sphincter, which can give the male the urge to go, but the bladder is not full, and also can obstruct flow of urine. And also, if you're obstructing the flow, then what could happen in the kidney itself, right? You could actually keep the bladder fuller than it should be, and that can lead to the kidney not cleansing well, and can lead to increased kidney and cystitis, bladder infections as well. Males, second most common type of cancer in men after lung cancer is prostate cancer. Not that uncommon at all. It usually goes unnoticed until it causes pain. The problem is usually it has metastasized before the male senses any problem. And so this is why guys endure a digital rectal exam often, especially, I don't know exactly when, but starting around age 30 for sure, your doctor will probably give you guys a rectal exam. If you think about the location of the prostate, it's very palpable from the rectum. And so feeling for an enlargement of the prostate is an early screening for prostate cancer. You can also look at PSA levels or acid phosphatase in the blood, and those will become elevated in prostate disease as well. The penis has 3 cylindrical bodies of erectile tissues. You've seen these in lab. Again, there's the corpus spongiosum back in 105. That was the layer that's going around the urethra. And then there are 2 corpus cavernosa, which are also filling with blood. These 3 cylinders are spongy, if you will. They're filled with lacunae. And where have we seen the word lacunae before? In bone or in cartilage, the lacunae were the little spaces or cavities. So again, the erectile tissues have these lacunae-like structures that can fill with blood. And there are trabeculi. Where have we seen that word before? Trabeculi was what we described as the inside of like a spongy bone. So that, again, a bunch of little cavernous spaces, and that is able to fill with blood to maintain erection. If you look at, in 105, I always said the cross-section of the penis looked like Mr. Bill, right? I always looked at it like this. I always imagine it looking like this, and then the urethra here. But when I look at this picture, it looks like something off Bug's Life. It looks like an ant, does it not? The ants on Bug's Life? You with me? Okay, that's what I see, right? So little eyes, but this is the urethra here, surrounded by the spongiosum, and then the 2 cavernosa. Okay, any questions on just structures? Semen, seminal fluid, anything at all? I know we won't have time to go into all of this in the female, but we'll get through some of this in the male. So we know that the reproductive system remains dormant from birth through early teenage years, typically. Puberty comes in guys somewhere between 10 and 12. Early signs start to happen. In the women, it is earlier, typically. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be a surge of gonadotropins. Now, what's gonadotropin mean to you? It ends in IN. It's a protein. It's a hormone. Tropic influences the gonads, right? So gonadotropins are hormones that are going to influence the gonads, and they're going to be released by the pituitary gland, and this is going to get the puberty started. Adolescence will be that period from the beginning of the gonadotropin secretions until one reaches their adult height. That's one definition of adolescence. Puberty would be would be the first few years of adolescence until the first menstrual cycle in girls or the first ejaculation with visible sperm in boys. Now, I don't know many people who are watching for that moment, right? The guys. And the girls, it's pretty obvious. Guys, I don't know where they get this definition. But typically, this can be between 12 and 13. As far as endocrine control of puberty, there's actually a lot of testosterone being produced in the first trimester of fetal development, and that's all dealing with the time where the gonads are being formed in the male. They're very low up until puberty, and then there's a spiking of testosterone that begins with puberty and then stays pretty high throughout adulthood. Of course, now you can't turn on the television without hearing about low T levels, and that's sort of the new experiment out there, I think. Talking with my doctor this morning, he said there's 3 good studies out there on testosterone levels in men, and all of them indicate that men who take testosterone are higher risks for cancer and heart disease. So it's kind of a questionable procedure at this point. Yes, testosterone levels do drop in men. Men do go through an andropause, if you will, like women go through menopause. And I would argue that's the way the good Lord made it, and let's not mess with it, right? There's not a reason, I don't think, for men to be walking around with hormone injections as age 40 and 50-year-old men. That just doesn't seem necessary. But hey, people make different choices. But those hormones are definitely being released from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and are definitely in control of the reproductive systems. So let's figure out what's going on. This is true for both sexes. The hypothalamus will begin to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Recall that, and I know you love your hormones, anything with releasing in it you know is coming from the hypothalamus. So the gonadotropin-releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus and goes just a short distance down to the anterior pituitary, where there it will cause the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, when you hear about FSH and LH, you normally think of female hormones, right? Because FSH and LH are both released. They spike right before ovulation. And if we get that far today with the female, we'll hear those hormones again. But FSH and LH are also very important for the male. And FSH stimulates those Sertoli cells, those nursing cells, and they keep the androgen binding levels high. And then luteinizing hormone is also known to help stimulate testosterone. So these are both very important in male. Puberty, again, when the hormones begin, we start having the secondary sex hormones kicking in with the secondary sex characteristics. Testosterone causes a elongation of limbs, causes an increase in muscle mass and a thickening of the larynx, which leads to a lower voice. Now, when testosterone levels begin to drop, men do experience a lack of or a less robust muscle mass, and that is probably one of the few reasons I can argue that men with low testosterone might consider testosterone replacement if they're starting to see a muscle mass decrease, right? Not so much for the sex drive, but if they're seeing a lower muscle mass, then that might be an argument for testosterone patches. Testosterone is also influencing the erythropoiesis, the making of red blood cells, which is why men have higher hematocrits, right? They have more red blood cells. It also increases the basic metabolic rate. So as testosterone levels to go down, what are guys going to experience? Look at this. Testosterone is involved with erythropoiesis, keeping your BMR, your basal metabolic rate high, and increase in appetite. So what's going to happen with guys' low T levels? Lower energy because of lower red blood cells and lower hematocrit, so that's a complaint. The BMR goes down, so they start to gain a little weight, right? A little less energy, gaining some weight, so those are some of the problems that people are experiencing. The hormones are also responsible for the pubic hair, for the scent glands that form, and for sex drive and sperm production. There is a hormone, testosterone is maintained, and testosterone levels also are going to maintain sperm production and sex drive. There's another hormone, though, called inhibin that is released from the Sertoli cells. Now, I keep saying Sertoli cells. These sustanacular cells, if you look back, I mentioned the sustanacular cells were also the Sertoli cells. So whenever you see that word, those are the Sertoli cells, or the nurse cells. And they are actually producing inhibin, and this is going to suppress FSH. And what this can do is have an effect on reducing sperm production without reducing testosterone secretion. If we have time, we'll talk about that feedback. Well, here it is. Sorry. We do have time. Here it is. Let's take a look at this. I know it's kind of small. The green is stimulatory signals. The red is inhibitory signals. So what's starting this whole thing? So we've got signals coming down from the hypothalamus. Again, that GnRH. It comes down and it stimulates the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is going to make FSH and LH, and those hormones are going to come down. FSH going down to the Sertoli cells, LH coming down to the interstitial cells, or the Leydig cells. The Leydig cells are going to produce testosterone. That testosterone is going to be important for spermatogenesis, but it's also going to go off and be responsible for secondary sex characteristics and maintenance of sex organs and increasing libido, sex drive. That testosterone is also going to feedback, inhibit, and decrease GnRH and decrease the release of the pituitary hormones to keep all this in check. So it's classic feedback. So you've got production of testosterone. It has a job But testosterone also goes back and feedback inhibits all of these hormones. And then the Sertoli cells do make this inhibin, which does go back and can inhibit or reduce the amount of FSH. So there's a slightly separate negative control going on within the male. Peak testosterone is around age 20. So guys, age 20, that's where it is max. Okay, sex drive, if you will, is the greatest there. But it does decline. It still stays high enough for sperm production. A male in his 70s is still producing enough sperm to father children, if the woman, of course, is in the right age bracket. But it does decline. So there's no doubt that testosterone levels do decline, and that will decrease the testosterone levels, lead to muscle mass issues, BMR issues. Also, there's a rise in FSH and LH secretions. Now, this makes sense. If you go back and look, I'm going to go back. If I'm not making as much testosterone, if the male's not making as much testosterone, then there won't be, or I should say, if this inhibit's not happening, then there wouldn't be a negative feedback on LH and FSH. So what would you expect to happen? With aging, what's going to go up? There's going to be a rise in FSH and LH, right? Because there's lower inhibin. And this can lead to the andropause effects. And so this is why some guys do have hot flashes, and some have, quote, illusions of suffocation. It's really no different than menopause. It's not usually as great as women experience, but there definitely is a hormonal connection here. Again, what's rising are, quote, female hormones, right? The FSH and the LH we think of as being female hormones, and as those rise a little bit higher, that can lead to these effects. Again, most guys won't have any effect or very little compared to what women will experience, but it's not undocumented at all. Also, with lower testosterone, it's also possible to have erectile dysfunction. Again, can't turn on the TV without hearing about this one. So not uncommon, 50% of men, 20% of men in their 60s would have ED, and up to 50% of those in their 80s would have erectile dysfunction. Okay, so those are the things that guys get to look forward to as we get older, right? Any questions so far? Andropause, semen, male production, anything at all? Hormones? Sperm would not be possible without the process of meiosis. Not that we're going to dive into this in any great detail, but remember, meiosis is a type of cell division where, in the case of the sperm, you start with one spermatogonium and you end up with 4 sperm cells. And in the egg, we'll see a little different story. But for the male, 1 cell forms 4. And remember, each of those cells is being formed in the process of spermatogenesis. And spermatogenesis occurs in the seminiferous tubules. And what's going to be formed are the sperm. They're the motile cell. And again, they have 23 chromosomes, right? They're considered haploid. So the sperm are haploid, the egg is haploid, and at fertilization, the zygote now is restored to diploid 46. At the top of this is the lumen. So we're looking at a really large seminiferous tubule, right? We're cutting into it, as you can see here in this picture. And this would be the lumen, the center of that tubule. And the cells are on the outside. Those are the spermatogonia. They are marked as 2N because they're diploid cells. And they're going to undergo meiosis. They're going to divide once and then a second time to form 4 cells. Those cells undergo a rapid change such that they develop their flagellum, I should say singular, and the little head structure. And as you saw in 105, they back out tail first into the lumen. At this point, they're not motile yet. They don't have the ability of swimming. They're going to be carried by fluid movement to the epididymis. And in the epididymis, they'll learn how to swim. They'll mature a little bit, grow up a little bit, and then upon ejaculation are able to be motile. The blood testis barrier is shown here. it's not shown super well, but these cells, okay, the cells that are around this big cell right here that I'm kind of putting a big rectangle about, that is actually a Sertoli cell. So that Sertoli cell, or the sustanacular cell, right? The Sertoli cell. And what that Sertoli cell is doing, look what it's doing. It's kind of wrapping around and protecting the sperm production. And those Sertoli cells are also maintaining blood-brain barrier. The blood flow to the testis would be out here. So there would be blood vessels out here, outside, and there would be immune cells in that blood. And as sperm are being produced, these Sertoli cells are going to make sure that the blood cells can't get to the newly developed sperm, because, again, these sperm would be considered foreign antigens, right? And they would be attacked by the male's immune system. So I've already mentioned this cell, spermatogonia, plural. And these cells are sitting around the periphery or the outside edge of all the seminiferous tubules. They're going to divide by normal mitosis. If all the spermatogonia became sperm, there'd be no leftover germ cells, right? So the germ cells have to once divide themselves, and then one of those two daughter cells then continues, and the other cell basically replaced itself. So we have to make sure that there is a division of these cells. The type A cell just stays as a stem cell. The type B cell then continues through the meiotic process to becoming sperm. So again, these the Sertoli cells, the sustanacular cells, are going to protect the sperm-producing cells by maintaining that blood-testis barrier. And we're not going to get into all the fanciness here, but there's going to be two layers of meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And in the end, we end up with 4 spermatogonia, or sperm. The process of going from 4 little spherical sperm cells to motile sperm, that last process is called spermiogenesis. Recall, that's not the full process. The full process is called spermatogenesis. But that little subset of it is called spermiogenesis, and that is the transformation of going from a spherical cell to the motile cell. So just to go through those terms again on this slide, this would be a spermatogonium here. It's going to divide, and then one of those cells will continue to make 2 cells, and then those 2 cells make 4 cells. Those are your 4 individual cells, but those are called spermatids. Be right there, Jared. Those are spermatids. Those are spherical cells, and then from the round spherical cell to what we recognize as being a sperm with the head, the neck piece, and the tail, that subset is spermiogenesis. Question?
I was just wondering, the spermatogonia divided into 2 cells.
Yep.
How does the body know which one?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I don't understand. There's some signals that we don't have time to talk about. But as that one cell divides, right, one of them replaces the stem cell. It would have to be, right? Now, inside what causes one cell to know that I'm not going to divide and the other one to divide is, actually, I don't even remember that story right now. I'm not sure we even completely understand it. It'd be no different, though, for any other stem cell in our body, would it? So we appreciate that if you cut your skin, there are stem cells here in your skin that are going to come to the rescue and are going to be so woken up, if you will, and repair. But the first time you cut yourself, right, every stem cell does not just come to the rescue, and then if you cut yourself there again, oh well, I've used up all my stem cells. So anywhere in our body, stem cells always divide to replace themselves and then know to go on. Half of them, and the other half know just to keep the barrel full, replenish those cells. It's a good question. And I don't know that I completely understand it, and I'm not sure that we completely understand the whole thing either. The process of spermiogenesis, again, there's that word, spermiogenesis. This is simply the transformation of going from a spherical spermatid to a mature sperm. So just this process. Now what happens is that most of the cytoplasm gets discarded. So a sperm is really nothing more than a motile, tail-swinging, mitochondrial-rich missile, right, with DNA in the tip. And that's really what it is. There's no extra cytoplasm. There's no extra nutrients. At the very tip of the head, there's the acrosome. The acrosome is a bag of enzymes that are going to be necessary to break through the outer layers of the egg. And all the mitochondria are going to set up here in the neck piece or the mid piece. And they're going to be using the energy from the fructose and from the citric acid that's in the secretions and make the ATP necessary to swing that tail. Sperm have a very long journey in front of them compared to their size. When you consider how small sperm are in their journey through the vagina, through the uterus, and through the fallopian tubes, it's a rather monumental task. Typically, a spermatozoan, remember what zoo means? Animal, right? We go to the zoo to see animals. So it was thought that these were little animals. Historically, they didn't understand what sperm were. They thought they literally were the little animals. There were even historically people who thought that the embryo was squeezed inside the head of the sperm, right? And that was sort of a very male egotistical view, that the embryo was there was a little miniature embryo inside the head of the sperm. Others said, oh no, the little embryo must already be in the egg, and the sperm must be the nourishment. So there were different views on this for years and years, through centuries, until it was understood under the microscope what one was looking at, that both egg and sperm were producing DNA that were combining in equal numbers, right, for fertilization. But there were some really interesting historical stories about what was thought. Again, there's a tail, right? That's going to be mostly the flagella, and there's going to be a very tip of the flagella as well, called the end piece. So just looking at the pieces of the mature sperm, again, we've got the head. In there is the nucleus with the DNA, and at the very tip, the acrosome, that bag of enzymes. The mid piece is going to have all of the mitochondria, and then there's going to be microtubules that are going to be part of the flagellum. Semen, seminal fluid or semen is on average going to be about 2 to 5 milliliters per ejaculate. 2 to 5 mils, what is that in kitchen terms? 2 to 5 mils. In kitchen terms, what is that? 5 mils is a teaspoon, right? So we're talking about half a teaspoon to a teaspoon as far as average ejaculate. 60% of that fluid will be seminal fluid from the seminal vesicles. 30% will be the prostatic fluid. The other 10% are basically the volume of the sperm themselves. Normal count, 50 to 100 million per milliliter, which is saying what? Somewhere between 100 and 600 million sperm per ejaculate. Anything less than 20 to 25 million sperm per mil is considered infertile. In other words, the way I think about it, anything less than 100 million sperm is going to be infertile. Okay, so if there isn't at least about 100 million sperm present in the total ejaculate, then the male is considered infertile. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't do some in vitro fertilization and help the process along in a test tube, but it takes one egg and it takes 100 million sperm to get the job done. Pretty amazing when you imagine the number of sperm that die off. They can't do the race. They swim in circles. They have 2 flagella. They take the wrong turn at the fallopian tubes, right? They get stuck in the cervix. There's all sorts of places where sperm get stuck, and there may only be a couple hundred or even 1,000 that reach the actual area of the egg. I mentioned this in passing already, so here are the details. So the prostate. The prostate is giving out about 30% of the fluid. It's a thin, milky, white fluid. It has nutrients in it. It also has clotting enzymes in it, which are going to be important. And also this prostate-specific antigen, the PSA, that is used as a measure of prostate health, is released. Now, what it actually is a protease. It's an enzyme, which is going to help the sperm liquefy the sticky semen. The seminal vesicles are more of a yellowish, viscous fluid. Again, those are lots of fructose and carbs, citrate for energy, prostaglandins, and a molecule, proseminoled. If I can't say it, you don't need to know it. But it's basically a naturally occurring antibiotic that males produce. all of the components are important, right, in semen. So the stickiness, even the viscosity of semen is important for promoting fertilization because you have to have the semen to stick to the vaginal wall, stick to the cervix, and then there has to be the sperm getting stuck in that viscous fluid. And then the seminal vesicles are producing prostaglandins, and those are going to help stimulate the uterus and stimulate the cervix as a smooth muscle relaxer. So about 20 minutes after ejaculation, the PSA, the serine proteases, are going to break down the clotting factors and start liquefying the semen. That's going to activate the sperm as well as allow them to wiggle out of the seminal fluids. And also that stickiness is going to assure that all of the sperm does not drain back out into the vagina, that it gets up into the cervix. 2 requirements for sperm motility: elevated pH and energy source. So what do we know about the vagina? Acidity, it's quite low, right? Quite acidic. And if you put sperm directly into the vagina, they would not survive. So you need to have an elevated pH, something more basic, more neutral for the sperm to become motile. And also there needs to be an energy source. And the energy source, the fructose, the citric acid, is being provided by the seminal fluids. And those sugars are now going to be the source of ATP produced by the mitochondria that are plentiful in the sperm. Questions on any of the glands or semen or components of semen? Nothing yet? Okay, moving on. So we'll go into the male sexual response. This became sort of, I won't call it table conversation, but certainly before the 60s, people didn't go around talking too much about the phases of intercourse. But Masters and Johnson, sort of a big writing in the late 60s in that sexual revolution time, made it more of a researched area. And they described it as following, that there are 4 phases within intercourse: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And knowing these 4 stages helped to help lead couples through those who are having any kind of sexual dysfunction. You could also refer to this as coitus or copulation. Any of those terms are equivalent. So what's going on in the male then? There is the pudendal artery. The pudendal artery was listed, I believe, in 105. I never really talked about it. It is an artery that's coming off down by the sacrum in the lower pelvic area. And that penile or pudendal artery is the one that's going into the penis, and it's going to divide into the dorsal artery and the deep artery. The dorsal artery is going to be on the dorsal surface, obviously, and is going to go to the corpus spongiosum. The deep artery is going to go to the corpus cavernosa, okay, and there is going to be filling up the blood for the erection there. The deep dorsal vein is then going to drain the blood from the penis. The penis is also innervated. Tactile, pressure, temperature receptors, a largely sensory area. And the nerves have the same name, the dorsal nerve and the pudendal nerve. So the artery and the nerves have the same name. They're traveling to the same parts of the body. There are autonomic and somatic motor fibers traveling to the penis. So what does that mean? Autonomic, things that the guy can't control, and then there are also somatic fibers going, which are, if you will, voluntary. So sympathetics and parasympathetic signals are both necessary for normal male function. And you'll hear it called point and shoot. So parasympathetic is responsible for inducing the erection, and sympathetic is necessary for the actual ejaculation. So both parasympathetic and sympathetic signals are necessary. Normally we think of those as being yin-yang, right? That sympathetic and parasympathetic are working in opposing times. But this is one situation, there aren't many, where both sympathetic and parasympathetic signals are responsible for normal male functioning. And just remember, point and shoot. Parasympathetic for erection, ejaculation is sympathetic. So going through these stages, an excitement phase. This is going to involve vasocongestion, basically swelling of the genitals with blood, erection, muscle tension, myotonia, and increased heart rate, blood pressure, and pulmonary ventilation. The bulbourethral glands will begin to secrete their fluid, and this can be initiated by both in the male pretty easily through visual stimulation as well as tactile stimulation. There's also the parasympathetic triggering of the erection is done by the neurotransmitter nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is a gas. So it's an unusual neurotransmitter. Normally we think of neurotransmitters as being proteins, right? But NO, nitric oxide, is a gas, and it's going to cause the dilation of the deep arteries and the filling of the corpus spongiosum and the corpus cavernosa, and also the testes can become larger as well during this time. Plateau time is when all of this is staying increased, if you will. There's more muscle contraction, myotonia, and this can be for seconds to minutes before actual orgasm. So looking at this little, the picture isn't necessary right yet, but just knowing that the parasympathetic side is going to be, again, like I said, point and shoot. So parasympathetic is going to be for the formation of the erection. And what we see here is that there's a couple different ways for this to occur. There can be visual or mental or other stimuli, right? That's voluntary, coming down the spinal cord and going through the pelvic nerves to the pudendal nerves and the dorsal nerves to cause erection. There can also be simply physical stimulation of the genitals. Either one is going to cause the excitement stage. And then if there's continued sympathetic surges, that can get you, again, sympathetic, right? Sympathetic signals would lead to orgasm. And then oops, get this right. And then after orgasm, we'll get to that in a moment, but there are also then more signals coming in, and finally resolutions. Let me get to the rest of these stages before I go through that image. Orgasm or climax is a more intense time, lasting between 3 and 15 seconds. Again, these are just normal ranges, and it's during this time that the semen is being released, and the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the breathing is greatly elevated at this point. Ejaculation is actually broken up into 2 stages, both with E, or actually ejaculation, emission, and expulsion, so 3 E's here. Emission is, again, the sympathetic nervous system stimulating the peristalsis, which is going to propel the sperm through the ducts. And then expulsion is actually the reflex, the muscle contractions leading to the expulsion. So emission, the movement of the muscles and the semen through the tubes, and then the actual expulsion. During this reflex, the internal urethral sphincter is closed. So that's going to mean that semen cannot go up into the bladder. So you can picture the vas deferens coming up, going by the seminal vesicles and into the ejaculatory duct, right? And that duct drains now into the urethra. Right above that would be the internal sphincter going into the prostate, going up into the bladder. So upon this sympathetic reflex, there is a closing of the internal sphincter so that sperm has no way to go but down. It can't go up into the bladder. So that, by definition then, ejaculation and orgasm are not necessarily the same. They can occur separately. And then after all this resolution, the body's returning back to its pre-excitement stage. The penis loses the erection, and this is followed by a refractory period. And we've seen that term before in the action potentials. And basically, this is a time following ejaculation where it's impossible for the male to attain another erection. This could be from minutes to hours. So again, that just has to do with individual refractory periods. But there can be a very short, almost an absolute refractory period, but then there's that idea of a relative refractory period, how much more stimulation is necessary to achieve erection a second time. And then finally we get to the little blue pill, right? What's going on as far as all the commercials that we're reading about. And I mentioned to you in passing that sexual stimulation, that nitric oxide is the neurotransmitter that is involved with causing erection. So I'm not going to get into all the middle stuff here, but nitric oxide leads to what? Vasodilation and erection. And there is a molecule that is necessary to degrade and to have the loss of erection. And what Viagra and Cialis and all these medications do is they inhibit this step, right? So they don't allow for the loss of the erection. So it continues to release nitric oxide, and it doesn't allow for the enzymes necessary to have the loss of erection. And that's why those commercials always say, you know, if you have an erection that lasts more than 4 hours, you should consult your physician, because if the pressure within the penis stays too high too long, you can damage the corpus cavernosum, the corpus spongiosum. And so you wouldn't want to have an erection that lasts too long, where you could have damage to the tissues themselves. So that brings us to the end of male. Well, that was faster than I thought it would be. So let's take about a 5 or 6 minute break and think of any questions you have, and we'll come back and we'll continue on with female. Okay, so female reproductive system, moving on. Anything in the male, anything at all? Anything at all in the male? If nothing's coming to mind, then let's move along. Again, comparing and contrasting what's different between the male, what's different in the female. You know your anatomy. In a moment, I'll skip over those 4 to 34 slides. But of course, the female reproductive system is going to be more complex. It has more purposes, if you will, not only the gamete production and the hormone production, but also for development of the fetus and all that good stuff. The female system is also much more cyclic. The male, you know, after puberty, the hormone levels are pretty high, and they stay high throughout life. They do decline, but they're always there. Females are much more cyclic, and we'll hopefully have some time to look at the ovarian and menstrual cycles. Again, there's no difference between the two sexes in the early weeks, and as I said, the female structures are going to form out of the Mullerian ducts, and not because of any positive action of any hormone. This happens by default. Remember, the male is going to be forming testosterone. The male is also releasing what? Remember, the male is also releasing an anti-Mullerian or a Mullerian inhibiting factor, MIF. And so there is no MIF, there is no testosterone, and so the female forms through the Mullerian ducts. So let's flash through these slides. Again, without testosterone and without the Mullerian inhibiting factor, we'll get the Mullerian ducts, and that's going to give us all of the anatomy that we're familiar with in the female. What else? The ovary is surrounded by a capsule layer, just like the testes is. That's a new word for you, the tunica albuginea. Again, the testis has this on the outside, so does the ovary. The outer cortex, if you cut open into an ovary, the cortex, that's where the germ cells will develop. And what are those germ cells in the egg? Sorry, in the ovary? Not spermatogonia, but oogonia, right, or oogonia. Right? So the oogonia are the germ cells for the female. And then inside, in the medulla of the ovary, that's where you'll find some arteries and veins. The ovary itself doesn't have ducts on the inside. Instead, the egg develops in its own little follicle structure that is released upon ovulation. There are some ligaments. The ovaries, plural, left and right, are connected to the uterus through an ovarian ligament. They are attached to the pelvis by a suspensory ligament, and they're also anchored to the broad ligament by the mesovarium. And I think I'm going to give you permission right now not to worry about mesovarium or broad ligament. Okay, so don't worry about that last statement. The ovary is going to receive blood from 2 arteries. There's going to be the uterine artery coming to the uterus, and then there's also the ovarian artery, which is going to be basically the same as the testicular artery in the male. There are anastomoses along the margin, that is, branches and multiple ways that blood can get to the ovary. And just like the spermatic cord has all those structures going to it, the ovary also has veins and lymphatics and nerves all traveling through the suspensory ligament. Think of that as sort of being equivalent to what's going through the spermatic cord. If you take a look inside the ovary, this is a very simplified picture, but around, this would be the suspensory ligament. and again, all those blood vessels coming into and out of the ovary through that. You could also refer to this area of the kidney, or sorry, of the ovary as the hilum, right? Just like the kidney. So there's an area where everything's going in or out of the ovary, just like in the kidney, the hilum. Vince, question?
Is there also a blood barrier?
There isn't as much, and that is because those follicular cells are surrounding the egg. So the egg is surrounded, so good point, the egg is surrounded by those follicular cells and then are released away from the bloodstream into the duct. And so those follicular cells are creating, I suppose, a blood barrier similarly. Within the ovary, if you looked on the inside, you would see lots and lots of, these would be the primordial follicles, and these are the early, there's labeled there. These are the primordial follicles, and they're going to be sitting in the cortex. And then what happens? Once puberty begins, and once hormones start being released in a cyclic way, some of those primordial follicles, usually around 20 of them or so every month, will be randomly awoken, if you will, and begin a developmental journey. And some will become primary follicles, some will become secondary follicles. I'm not going to worry about the difference in those. We're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Along the way, most of them are going to drop off, such that only one of those 20s will be 20 that start will become the mature follicle. That is the follicle that will then erupt out of the ovary upon ovulation. The cells that are left behind in and around that mature follicle will become the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will begin to secrete hormones, progesterone specifically, mostly, and after about 10 to 13 days, I'll go through all this with you in a minute, but after about 10 to 13 days, it stops releasing hormones and regresses to become the corpus albicans. Again, you can see all the blood vessels coming in. The other side, there's the ovarian ligament on the other side. So when we look at the bigger picture, the ovarian ligament's going over to the uterus, isn't it? So the uterus would be over here and connected to the ovary, and then here's the suspensory ligament. These are the fimbriae, and those fimbriae are going to catch the egg. So here the egg is being released over here, but there'll be fimbriae kind of all over the place, and they would catch that egg and draw it into the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. So this gives us more of a full view of this. So here's the ovary connected to the ovarian ligament to the uterus. The suspensory ligament's over here. The uterine tube or fallopian tube comes over and always kind of does a little loop-de-loop coming around, and the little fimbriae at the end. Here we can see the inside of the uterus. The inner layer of the uterus is called the endometrium. The muscle layer of the uterus would be called the myometrium, and the outer layer would be called the perimetrium around the outside. The dome of the uterus is the fundus, and the uterus continues into a narrow neck-like region called the cervix that projects into the vagina. The uterine tube has along it some ciliated cells. Kind of makes sense, right? Because as the egg is released, it's going to be kind of moved along through the fallopian tube by those cilia. Fertilization normally happens up in the ampulla, and the ampulla is this region up in here. And so if you think about the egg being released from the ovary, picked up by the fimbriae, the egg is only viable for about 24 hours, and the sperm are viable for about 72 hours. So you've got quite a difference there. So that means that sperm would have to have already been here 2 to 3 days before ovulation or arrive within 24 hours after ovulation for successful fertilization. So here you're looking at just a representation of it's a color-enhanced micrograph, and you can see all those cilia that are in there. There would also be some lymphatic cells, a lot of lymphatic cells, a lot of protective structures going through that uterine tube as well. The uterus itself is a very muscular chamber, if you will. It's going to tilt forward over the bladder. It's going to be the place of gestation during pregnancy. And as I already mentioned, the dome of the uterus is called the fundus. The majority of it's called the body. And the cervix is the cylindrical conical end that projects into the vagina. The lumen of the uterus, it's roughly triangular. If you take a look at it, so more sort of triangular. And the cervical canal being at the more inferior end. There are lots of glands along the way that are producing mucus. This is going to prevent the spread of microorganisms from the vagina up into the uterus. So these glands are always secreting and moving things down away from the uterus. So there's this constant secretion and migration away from the uterus. There's a broad ligament in place. The broad ligament is what's holding the uterus in place. That's what's shown here. And so there'll be one on the other side as well. Again, there's that suspensory ligament going up, and here's the ovarian ligament on this side. Pap smear, very important screening tool, named after a guy, a Greek guy with like 17 syllables in his name, but first part of his name was Pap. So that's where we get the meaning for this, right? Papillopoulos, something like that, right? And so Pap smear is basically what one is doing is looking for cervical cancer. This is a common cancer, if you will, between younger women. And so this is something that women endure as far as testing, looking for early changes in the cervical cells. And so by taking some epithelial cells from the cervical os area, then we can look for abnormal cells. There's a fairly high number of false positives, right? Some problems with this, but at least if there is a problem, it can be looked at more carefully. And what causes an increase in cervical cancer, the big one that we hear about now is the human papillomavirus, right? HPV. And so right now, ladies are getting vaccinated against HPV, and probably even more important now, little boys are being vaccinated against HPV as well, because where little girls get it, they get it from little boys. And so boys are being vaccinated as well against HPV. I think right now they're telling, is it 10? 10 and up should be vaccinated for HPV. They really want to get it before anyone becomes sexually active. And women can get that, I think, through insurance now through age 26, assuming that by age 26, the window of first sexual encounter has been closed. And so that's where they're doing that statistically. So somewhere around age 10 to 12, boys and girls are getting this shot. Also smoking, earlier sex activity, as well as STDs are all known to also increase the risks of cervical cancers. When a person has a pap smear done, they're going to, again, look for cells at the cervix and examine those, and don't worry about the classes, but if you have a class 1, that would be sort of a mild abnormality. Class 2 would be significant enough of a change that it would require a biopsy, and class 3 suggests that it's already spread and a hysterectomy would be required. So you want to definitely catch something like this in the early stages of class 1. Again, the outer layer of the uterus is called the perimetrium, right? That would be the serous membrane, the peritoneum that goes around the more superior portions of the uterus. The myometrium is the muscular layer. This is going to be smooth muscle, involuntary muscle, and it's going to get much, much thicker during pregnancy and becomes less muscular and more fibrous toward the cervix, so that during childbirth you can get through that thick muscular wall. And also that thickness of the uterus is going to be necessary for labor. Excuse me. The endometrium is the inner layer. This is the layer that's going to slough off with menstruation. And there are two parts to the endometrium. And I think this will make sense to you in a moment. There's the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis. So the stratum functionalis would be the layer that's, quote, functional. This is the layer that's going to slough off with menstruation. It's more superficial. It's more toward the lumen, toward the inside of the uterus. And then the basali, the stratum basali would be, the basalis would be the deeper layer. This is the layer that is not going to be sloughed off, but is going to be left behind and is going to regenerate each month within the endometrium. During pregnancy, the endometrium is also the area or the site of attachment and where the placenta will form to nourish the baby. I've already mentioned the broad ligament. I told you not to worry about the don't worry about the mesometrium. So just know that there's a broad ligament, and you see that in the pictures. And also there is a, you know what, we're not going to worry about this one either. Don't worry about the cardinal ligament either. Okay. Just know that the uterus is held in place. The round ligament is basically much like the gubernaculum in the male. So the round ligament is going to, there's a pair of them, and they are going to help position the uterus, if you will, during development. But other than that, no need to know any of the other names of these ligaments. So if you were to take out and do a complete hysterectomy, if you will, here, I mean, this is even more than that. This is going to be, you can see here the vagina. Let me get another color. So this is actually the vagina, and the cervix is up here, and the actual uterus going off to the fallopian tubes, and then here are the ovaries. So it's kind of, I would never ask you to label that, but that's everything taken out. If you take a look at the picture above now, you can appreciate that much easier in the cartoon. The endometrium, again, this is the layer that's going to slough off during menstruation. And so there are actual endometrial glands in here. I'm not going to have you label this, but it's the outer layer up here that is actually going to be sloughing off, okay, those cells here. The uterus is highly vascular, right? All this blood flow that's going to go to the uterus. There's a uterine artery. It's going to be coming off the internal iliac. Can you picture the internal iliac? Right? Can you picture it? So we've got the internal iliac artery. So that means that the aorta comes down, splits into the what? Right and left common iliac. Then there's that little inward internal iliac, and then the majority of it continues down out of the pelvis, right? As the external iliac and then the femoral. So this little internal, it makes sense, right? It's going into the pelvic area and into the reproductive areas. So the uterine artery is going to arise off that internal iliac artery and travel down and penetrate into the muscle layer of the uterus, and then is going to lead into some smaller arteries called the arcuate arteries. Now, arcuate, as the name suggests, they form an arc, right? And they form an arc that's going to travel in a circle around the uterus. From here, there are going to be small little spiral arteries. They're going to penetrate through the myometrium, the little spirals, and go into the endometrium. And these are the vessels that you'll see in a moment when I show you the uterus ripe and ready for implantation. It'll be the little spiral arteries that you'll see in the endometrium. So taking a look here, oh, so much better than my picture, right? So we've got the aorta, the common iliac, the little internal iliac, and here comes the branch now. You've got the vaginal artery that goes off to the vagina, but then there's also this uterine artery that comes, and then we see that it's going to go in and go around the arch, right, the arcuate arteries, and then those little tiny arteries that you're seeing going off, those are the little spiral arteries, and they're going to branch through the myometrium to the inner layer, the endometrium. Leaving the uterus, heading toward the vagina, distensible muscular tube. It's going to be the copulatory organ for the female, as well as the place of birth, of course. There's going to be layers here. The inner mucosal layer, the muscularis, the muscle layer, and then an adventitia. It's going to be tilted between the rectum and the urethra, if you will. And there are no glands here. There is some serous fluid that can be released from the cervical glands, but there's no true sweat glands within the vagina. What else do I want to know here? There are some friction ridges, much like what we see in the skin, and these are also like the vaginal rugae. These are going to provide some stimulation for the penis, as well as there's a mucosal opening across the vaginal opening called the hymen. And you'll hear about the hymen being penetrated or broken, which can be a sign of early abuse in a young girl. There's a dramatic change that happens in the vagina. In a young girl, the vagina is lined by simple cuboidal. Upon puberty, the estrogens released transform it to stratified squamous. So I've always said the vagina has stratified squamous non-keratinized, but in a young girl, it's going to be simple cuboidal, right? So it's not going to be protective. So the vagina is not protective against abrasion in a child. Upon puberty, now it becomes stratified. So this would be an example of metaplasia, right, where one cell type becomes another. And there's also going to be a large number of dendritic cells. Now, basically, think like these are immune cells, and they are heavily lining the vagina. That's a good thing, right? You would think a lot of immune cells in the vagina would be a good thing for the female reproductive and for the immune system. The problem is HIV tends to infect these cells, and that's how HIV infects female. So the very presence of these immune cells is actually now the pathway in to the female in most cases for the virus. Externally, right, the vulva is everything that's visible externally in the female. That's going to be the mons pubis, the labia major, and the labia minor. There is a vestibule. We've seen that term over and over. The vestibule is the entryway into the vagina, and there's going to be both a urethral and a vaginal orifice or opening into the vagina and into the urethra. The clitoris is the erectile sensory tissues. We know that. There are also some vestibular glands, and the vestibular glands are homologous with what in the male? The vestibular glands are going to be homologous with the Cowper glands or the bulbourethral glands, right? So these are the pre-ejaculatory lubricating glands of the female. So taking a look at the perineum, again, externally the vulva would be everything that's visible, the mons pubis, pubic hair across the pubic symphysis, the clitoris. The prepuce is basically the hood-like covering over the clitoris, and that would be equivalent to the foreskin on the penis, that little bit of covering. Then the labia major, the labia minor, in between would, quote, be the vestibule, the opening into, and there would be the opening into the vagina and the opening into the urethra. And the hymen would be this layer of tissue that sort of covers the opening into the vagina. So if you're thinking about the perineum, right, we go down, it would go from the mons pubis, triangular to the ischiotuberosities, and then down to the anus, and making those two triangles. So you can see the muscles that are involved here. So the little vestibular glands are shown here, and there are also some. This vestibular bulb again is just what's holding on all this fluid for lubrication. The ischiotuberosities, and then the anus shown here. The breasts, an important part of the female reproductive system, developing during pregnancy. Of course, they're pretty inactive up until that point, and under hormonal control, they're going to begin to produce milk, and then they will atrophy after the woman stops nursing. The breast has a body and a tail, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And the body has the nipple at its apex. The tail goes toward the armpit. So there's a lot of lymphatics in this area, and so women who have breast cancer, they check those axillary lymph nodes pretty carefully. The areola is the colored zone around the nipple, and there are lots of blood vessels here, lots of very sensitive, and also important for the reflex of nursing. So upon stimulation, the female will let down, if you will, milk, and that's also hormonal, but also reflexive in part. There are sweat glands also, areolar glands that are around the mammary glands, and these are going to help protect against chafing and cracking during nursing, but most mothers will tell me they don't do enough, right? That nursing is pretty miserable in the first few days. So guys and female helpers, right, just be really, really sympathetic during those first weeks of breastfeeding because it can be rather, rather painful. What else is going on with breastfeeding? Not only is it painful because of chafing and cracking, but what else is going on, especially right after birth? Anybody know? Suckling on the breast also releases oxytocin. And oxytocin is telling the uterus to contract. And so after birth, especially the first few hours of breastfeeding, not only is mom exhausted and everything else, but as the baby is trying to suckle, it's causing the clamping of the uterus, which can be very, very painful. So you've got the painful uterine contraction continuing with the awkwardness, or if you will, of breastfeeding, especially the first time around. Non-lactating breasts can mostly fat, mostly collagen-like tissues, and then there are suspensory ligaments that are going to hold the breast to the pectoralis major. I'll show you to you in a moment. And then there are a series of ducts that are traveling through the breast, and they're going to become much more developed during pregnancy. And the lactiferous ducts are the ones that are going to drain the milk toward the nipple. So here's a picture of the breast. You can see there are all these glands within here. And during pregnancy, these glands get larger and start producing milk, traveling through the lactiferous ducts going toward the nipple. And then there are ligaments that are holding all of this to the pectoralis major and the pectoralis minor behind it. So a lot of this white stuff in here are ligaments and collagenous materials that are going to anchor the breast, if you will, to the muscle layers behind. And now you can really appreciate the ducts. This looks just like any other, oops. This could also be a salivary gland. This could be the part of the pancreas. This could be the lacrimal glands, right? They all look the same as far as exocrine glands releasing outside the body. Here you can really appreciate the amount of adipose and fat. And then if you look, you can see those white lines, and those would be some of the suspensory ligaments that are holding up the tissue back to the muscle wall of the pectoralis major and the pectoralis minor. Cancer, 1 in 8 for women. That number, I just was hearing a conversation recently that is a theoretical number, that it doesn't necessarily mean that. Someone was trying to play statistical games on the radio, and I forget exactly which way it went now that I think about it, but 1 in 8 may be a little bit of a misnomer. It may not be quite that bad, is basically what they were trying to suggest. But basically the tumors that are forming in breast cancer are coming from those mammary ducts. And the problem with breast cancer is we know that there's a lot of lymphatics here, those axillary lymphatics, and so breast tumors tend to metastasize, which is what makes them so dangerous. So that's why it's important for self-examination and yearly mammograms. But that was even questioned. Anybody reading this? It was thought that every woman age 40 on should get mammograms, right? And now I was just reading a Science News magazine a month ago suggesting that that may not be ideal, that the amount of radiation that women are being exposed to may actually be driving up the rate of cancer. And so there's a balancing act between having frequent mammograms and the risk of cancer. And if you know you have a family history of cancer or breast cancer, then you definitely want to be very proactive and have the mammograms done. And the study was suggesting that if you don't have a real history, you may not want to have them as often. You still want to have them, but not as often, because you are increasing the X-ray exposure to your body. So it's kind of a difficult thing to figure out. Now, one of the other things we know now is that there are some genes that are connected to breast cancer. Now, most breast cancer, I need to emphasize this, most breast cancer is non-hereditary. Okay. But there is a subset of breast cancer which we know is hereditary, and the genes are the BRCA1 and 2 genes. So women are getting tested for their presence of this gene. Now, even if they have the gene, it doesn't mean that they will necessarily develop breast cancer, but there's a much higher chance that they will. And some women, like maybe they have an aunt or a grandmother or mother who went through breast cancer, and then they're being tested, and if they find out that they have this gene, they're actually choosing prophylactic breast removal. So some women are choosing to go ahead and have the breast removed rather than the higher risk that they seem to think they have for developing breast cancer. The other side of this is that some women are getting tested and they find out, oh, Aunt Susie had, breast cancer, and I get tested and I don't have BRCA1 or BRCA2. So what does that woman maybe think? I will never get breast cancer. And so now she's not going to be as active about getting her mammograms. And what I'm telling you here is that most breast cancer is non-hereditary, right? So some women are getting this testing and thinking it's a green light not to be tested or in the future, and they're thinking that they're safe. And other women are, I don't want to say overreacting, but they're so horrified by the chance of having cancer that they're choosing to have their breasts removed long before any cancer was ever there. Risk factors for breast cancer we know do include as you get older, right? Can't change that. Increased radiation. So again, having X-rays can increase the rate of breast cancer. Smoking and all those things that are carcinogens, excessive alcohol and fat intake also are involved, and smoking. So all of those things. But 70% of cases have no identifiable risk factor and are not hereditary. So it is largely random. Therefore, when we think that there's no identifiable risk factor and no genetics involved, that makes us think that it's more what? Environmental, right? Something that the person has been exposed to. Diet, cancer, or smoking, something like that. So again, very important that there's a baseline mammogram, and this is changing, so I need to look into the studies more carefully. It's important that there's a baseline before you would ever have any sort of cancer, and then every couple of years, and then a higher rate as one gets older. What are some choices for breast cancer? Right? If there is a tumor, what can be done? If we find that it's just a small area, then a lumpectomy can be done. Just take out a lump of the breast tissue, save the rest of it. That would be if we know it has not metastasized. There could be a simple mastectomy, that is removal of just breast tissue. Maybe some of the axillary lymph nodes. That would be if it has spread a little bit, or we think it may have. There can also be a radical mastectomy, which is a removal not only of the breast, but also of all the muscle. This can go deep into the pectoralis major, the pectoralis minor, and what I've read is that radical mastectomies don't increase survivability. So sometimes going through that radical mastectomy is not any better or worse than just going through a simpler procedure. But again, that's very dependent upon the kind of cancer that you have and how far it's spread. Okay. Anything about the breast? Anything about female structures? Doing okay so far? Let's talk about a little bit of the hormones, puberty, and I think we'll probably get through a little bit about ovarian cycle and uterine cycle, and that'll probably be it for us in the next 20 minutes. But puberty, again, in females is going to start a little bit younger than males in our country, and the reason for that decreasing age, there's concern that some of it might be because of, anybody heard about environmental issues? Yep, I got it here too. Environmental issues, there's estrogens in the environment, and there are, hopefully it's about that 6 o'clock hour, right, where the internet starts doing weird things. But there are issues with environmental estrogen-like molecules, and that might be driving our puberty ages down in girls. Again, it's the onset of GnRH, the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus, and then the anterior pituitary is going to start releasing FSH and LH. That's exactly the same story, isn't it? It's exactly the same story. The estrogens, though, are going to be much higher in the female than in the male, and so the estrogens are going to start feminizing or causing the secondary sex characteristics in the female. Telarchy is the onset of breast development. This is going to be the earliest sign of puberty in girls, so that training bra, that first bra, that initiation of all this. And there's going to be continual breast development up till about age 20 with more adipose and fibrous tissue added. Pubarchy would be the appearance of pubic and axillary hair, so it would be the next step along the way. And that would be more the first step in males. And then menarche would be the first menstrual period. And it's important that a female has enough fat on her body to have a normal menstruation. Fat, cholesterol. Remember that cholesterol is the precursor for all the sex hormones. So you have to have enough fat, enough cholesterol to make enough estrogen, make enough progesterone. And so a woman who doesn't have at least 17% or so of fat will never begin to menstruate. And girls who become anorexic, I shouldn't say just girls, but boys become anorexic too, but girls who become anorexic and they don't have enough body fat will stop menstruating as well. So women, by their very nature, have to have a higher percentage of fat on their body to maintain normal reproductive function. So because we've had increased nutrition in our country, that's another way of thinking about it, our kids are fatter, if you will, and so menstruation has been able to start earlier. That's one other argument for the earlier menstruation age for women. Again, if the body fat drops too low, then the menstrual cycle can be interfered with, and typically the first few cycles in a female are going to be anovulatory, which means there's no egg. Right, so the first few menstrual cycles, there would not be an egg release. The ovaries are not necessarily fully ramped up. And usually, girls will begin ovulating regularly about a year after they begin menstruating. Estradiol is the... I'm not going to make a distinction between estradiol and estrogen. There are different kinds of estrogens, okay? And I'm just not going to get into that in this course. Estradiol is one of the very potent forms of estrogen. And this is going to stimulate the vaginal metaplasia. What was that? That was the moving or the changing from simple to stratified squamous. It's also going to stimulate the growth in the secondary sex organs and start the sex hormone production. It's going to make the girl's skin a little bit thicker, but still thinner than males. And it's going to also begin the deposition of fat in the breast. Progesterone, that's what estrogen's doing. Progesterone is primarily going to work on the uterus and make it possible for pregnancy to occur. Estrogens and progesterones are suppressed by FSH and LH, just like we saw before in the male. There's a negative feedback loop. And there's also inhibin made by the female, and that's also going to suppress FSH. So again, the difference in the female, though, is that the hormones are very cyclic. In the males, they're more just turned on and are kept at pretty high levels. There is a menopause, a cessation of menstruation that occurs. And let's back this up a little bit. So women are going to be born with about, and these numbers, you'll see different sources on these, but women are going to have about 2 million eggs. And menopause will begin when they're down to about 1,000 follicles left. Okay. So the woman will start with about 2 million eggs, and the beginning of menopause when there's about 1,000 of these eggs or follicles left. And the follicles become less and less responsive to the hormones. With menopause, the uterus, the breasts, the vagina begin to atrophy. Intercourse can become less comfortable because those vestibular glands are not working as well. The vagina becomes thinner. That's even on the commercials now, right? Vaginal dryness. You can't. Is there anything that's not mentioned anymore on the commercials? And because there's fewer secretions, vaginal infections can become more common, and the thin becomes the skin, so it becomes thinner. Cholesterol levels will also rise. So think about this. Cholesterol is the precursor for estrogen and progesterone. So if you're not making progesterone and estrogen anymore, your cholesterol levels will not be used, your cholesterol won't be made anymore to make the hormones. So cholesterol levels will begin to rise, and that leads to an increase in cardiovascular disease, and also bone mass begins to decline. There can also be a shifting in hormone levels, and this can lead to the hot flashes that are experienced in menopausal women. A lot of women are getting hormone replacement therapy, HRT. Again, that's becoming a little bit suspect in some women because there are risks and there are benefits. And so you have to be really, really careful if you're going to choose to have estrogen and progesterone dosing. Why do we have menopause? We don't have, right? Men continue to make sperm. Why do you think women, from an evolutionary standpoint, why would we have menopause? Here's one anthropologist who says, right, that basically older women would not live long enough to rear an infant to a survivable age, so it's better that she's no longer able to have children and let her help rear her grandchildren. Now that's sort of just one of those, I don't know how to describe that, but a theory, why do women have menopause? And clearly that window is no longer as definitive anymore, is it? Because people are having in vitro fertilization, women are having, are having babies later or are taking over the rearing of children much later through in vitro fertilization. Let's face it, in the old days, we didn't live past about 40, 50 anyway, so menopause wasn't really that far from death. Now it's, decades. Last 12 minutes or so, let's just talk about oogenesis and the sexual cycle a little bit. So really not much different. Oogenesis is the making of, that's spelled wrong, isn't it? Oogenesis, there's an E missing up there on the top. Oogenesis. We'll talk about both the reproductive cycle and the sexual cycle. And the sexual cycle will include the ovarian and menstrual cycles. So oogenesis, the making of eggs, it starts off in the ovary. We're going to be making these haploid gametes through meiosis, no different than what we talked about before. The difference is, though, is that the ovaries will only be releasing one egg per month on average. And this is going to be accompanied by some cyclic hormone levels. So the ovary, again, is formed from those early weeks. And the oogonia, those cells, which are similar to the spermatogonia in the male, are going to be the germ cells. The difference is that the woman is going to kind of jump in completely, and all of the oogonia will begin to develop, and there'll be about 5 or 6 million of them in early development. They'll all start to go through meiosis, and by the time a woman is born, many of them will have already atreused or broken down. So there's a 5 or 6 million starting point, and then the number undergoes atresia and drops down lower and lower. By the time a woman reaches puberty, maybe only about 400,000 of the eggs are left. And if you think about it, during the lifetime, a woman will ovulate probably fewer than 500 times. If you think about 40 years of ovulation and 12 to 13 cycles per year. The hormones involved, FSH, is going to be important for getting the oocytes to start meiosis. And what else? If the egg gets fertilized, then it must begin to divide. And so we'll see that FSH is important in the egg development. I'm going to go ahead and have you cross this slide off. So we're not going to worry about the polar bodies or anything like this as far as oogenesis. And, oh, here we go, 6 o'clock, right? So if you're looking at the inside of the ovary, try to get this to move along. Okay, so if you're looking inside the ovary, what you would see is that around the outside edge, this would be the cortex, and within the cortex would be all those primordial follicles. And again, those are going to be numbered maximally, and then treasing or dropping down during the lifespan. And then 20 or so of those every month is going to be chosen, and they're going to start developing into the follicles. In this picture on the right, you can see that much larger follicle. That would be the follicle on the right would be a much larger. You can see the egg in the center, the nucleus in the center, and the cells around it would be the cells that would become the corpus luteum. Well, I seem to be having some real connection problems here.